running series on the current landscape of Sino-American relations, where we look to shed light on the challenges and opportunities for the US and Chinese bilateral relationship in a 21st century that is increasingly defined by multipolarity and the specter of great power politics. My name is Arta Moini, and I am the Director of Research here at the Institute. IPD is a nonpartisan international affairs think tank committed to promoting and amplifying provocative, innovative thinking in North Atlantic foreign policy. We stand for dialogue, diplomacy, prudent realism, and military restraint, principles which we believe are the four cornerstones of sustainable peace in an increasingly complex and dynamic international system. Our first panel in this series, held last month, explored current perspectives on China among US national security and foreign policy establishment, seeking to make sense of the myriad of reasons that underlie the crystallizing narrative of China in the US that casts Beijing as a strategic nemesis and contributes to extreme threat assessments and the warring rhetoric of a new Cold War. In our second panel today, we want to turn our focus to the other side of the equation, to see how China views the world and how China's neighbors in Asia view it. To this end, we will examine the geopolitics of Asia in light of the US pivot to that region and delve into the Chinese perceptions of their place in the world with the hope that today's discussion can bring some much needed clarity and nuance into China's understanding of its international role and its relations with other countries amidst its own rising power. China, of course, has a long and tortuous history, but it would perhaps not be too far-fetched to argue that in its modern incarnation, that country is very much driven by a quest for recognition that is informed by its humiliating and debilitating experience dealing with the colonial powers and an aggressive bellicose Japan in the 19th and early 20th century. Evidently, we no longer live in the 19th century. The century of humiliation that began with the Opium Wars has long been left in the rearview mirror of history. And China has vowed never to be weak again, and some would even argue it is at last great again. Since the end of World War II and the civil war that brought to power the present government of the People's Republic of China, Beijing has become a key factor in international strategic calculations and diplomacy, as well as a major hub in global supply chains. More than most, it has benefited from the liberal hegemonic order and the international free trade regime to amass tremendous power. In fact, even without considering its growing military might, China now possesses the two most important levers of power. It is rich economically and in terms of human capital. So as we ponder the future prospects for the international system, with the unipolar moment at its end and American dominance eroding, what is certain is China will figure strongly in whatever order or disorder might come next. One large variable in speculating on this future is China's choices and strategic options. Many Western policymakers struggle to understand China's decision-making and its rather enigmatic strategic culture. And as we know, incomprehension often begets fear and reaction. Meanwhile, as a major civilization, China possesses thousands of years of strategic thought and has made a creed out of the principle of strategic patience. It has also become one of the foremost champions of Westphalian order of nation states in the world today, privileging state sovereignty as a cornerstone of its diplomacy. It is therefore more important than ever to make sense of the worldview of a state whose elite can keep its long-term strategic goals obscure and outsiders guessing. So does Beijing really have a grand design for the international order? And if so, how will it go about realizing this vision? What is China's grand strategy doctrine, and how do Chinese leaders understand their security dilemmas in the Indo-Pacific in light of strategic competition with the US? Do they believe in the inevitability of war akin to what Graham Allison has called the Thucydides Trap? What do they make of Washington's deterrence strategy and forward posture? What is the impact of Western economic sanctions and export controls that target their major technology companies on Beijing's strategic calculus? What is the future of Taiwan and the likelihood of conflict in the South China Sea over regional territorial disputes? And of course, how does the rest of the region, especially middle powers like Japan, Korea, India, Australia, and the rest, conceive of China's rise? Do they view China as a threat? And if so, do they have the interest, willingness, and capability to balance Beijing? These are the sort of questions that will hopefully animate our discussion today, and thankfully we have the perfect panel to help us make sense of them. So without further ado, let me introduce our moderator for today. Kurt Mills is a senior reporter at the American Conservative, where he covers national security and U.S. foreign policy, as well as a contributor to Unheard. Previously, he was a foreign affairs reporter for the National Interest magazine and a Robert Novak Fellow at the Fund for American Studies. He was also a 2019 Publius Fellow at the Claremont Institute. Before we start, a reminder that all our China discussions will be live streamed on YouTube, and a recording of each will be available on IPD's YouTube channel. I encourage you all to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, both to watch this program at your convenience and to be kept apprised of our upcoming program. Kurt, thank you for joining us today. I will let you take it from here and introduce our panelists.
Thanks. I'm usually in DC. I'm DC based, but I'm in South Carolina this week, and we're sort of in the eye of a tropical storm, which I viewed as a nice allegory of perhaps where U.S.-China relations are headed. However fortunate or unfortunate you think that is, and I'm gonna let the panelists introduce themselves and their own background and plug their own things. So we're going to go alphabetically. If we could start with short introductory remarks from Lyle.
Okay, sure. Great to be here with everyone. Thanks in particular to Arta for putting together a terrific panel. This is, I'm really honored to join all these people I admire on the panel. I want to start right away by saying these are my own opinions. Don't in any way reflect the assessments of the U.S. Navy or any agency of the U.S. government. I'm a professor at Naval War College. Well, overall, let me say this. I prefer a very succinct description of Chinese strategy, in part because I think Chinese themselves don't know where they're going, and I think it's very ad hoc, and they're making it up as they go along. And I also think we shouldn't overcomplicate as well. So I'll give you two Chinese characters: fu qiang, which means really to become wealthy and to become strong. And this is just echoes the way Arta skillfully set us up here. But China, I don't think it has a real sense of where it wants to go, what its sort of global vision is. We can talk about a few things, and I will, but more or less what all Chinese agree on is China will be very wealthy and very strong. And it's not quite where it wants to be yet on either of those indicators. So we'll start with those two characters. We might add four more. This phrase Chinese specialists use, "Tao Guang Yang Hui," which means to, as we say among China specialists, to hide and bide. And many people say in recent years, China is moving beyond this hide and bide strategy to something more assertive, if you will, although I'm not terribly fond of that phrase. We can talk about the Belt and Road. Some people would say that's China's strategy in a nutshell. I view that as relatively innocuous. And boy, I wouldn't want to be organizing the Belt and Road. I mean, just think Afghanistan is right in the middle of the Belt and Road, and yet, what a mess. So very hard to achieve, and it doesn't really bother me that they want to build infrastructure, roads, rails across Eurasia. That's okay in my book. Maybe there are environmental consequences we have to worry about, but I'm not too worried about strategic consequences. One of the best descriptions I heard of Chinese strategy was a few years ago when Harry Harding visited Naval War College and gave a great lecture. And he said, insightfully, I think he said, it's not that China wants to control its neighborhood, that it wants to tell the Cambodians and the Vietnamese how to live and how to structure their societies and what they need to do in every circumstance. That is not what China wants. But he said, what they want is a veto. They want to say to their neighbors, and maybe even a little further out from there, that you can't go about these things without at least thinking about Chinese interests at all. You can't trample on Chinese interests, and if something really bothers Beijing, they will let you know. But that still leaves quite a lot of autonomy to regional actors. So I don't think that they are pursuing kind of regional hegemony, even let alone global hegemony, which I think that notion is extremely far-fetched. We can also talk about the Thucydides Trap. I think Arta mentioned that. a very important concept in my view, and actually Xi Jinping just mentioned that the other day, apparently in conversation, and his comment was there was no such thing, which is interesting to say. But he said that countries may fall into traps of their own if they engage in strategic miscalculation. So, I mean, a bit of messaging there saying, well, this could happen, but it will be your fault, kind of. But that is important. I think it shows that the Chinese leadership recognizes the security dilemma and the issue of the Thucydides trap, rising powers, and so forth. Let's talk about spheres of influence. I do think that is applicable. I remember 5 years ago, I rolled out my book at Brookings, and Michael Swain put a great question to me. He said, what about the spheres of influence? Is that really your concept? And I do think that it could be a stabilizing force in U.S.-China relations. Right now, personally, I'm focused on Russia-China relations, and I'm amazed how much Chinese strategists talk and think about Russia. And I think it is partly by analogy. Their news programming is full of discussions about what NATO is doing in the Black Sea and so forth. So clearly they see an analogy, but they also want to lean on Russia as a support. You know, Russia has their back, Russia has a similar worldview and so forth. So that's quite interesting for the future of world order. Just wrapping up here, I got my eye on the time, don't worry, Kurt. I see in South China Sea, I view as a relatively stable situation. Taiwan, the opposite. I think Taiwan is very explosive, although I think I'm encouraged by what I hear in the last 48 hours on that. Some suggest that maybe this very unstable situation could be getting back on track. Some messaging from Washington and Beijing to that effect. What is really going on here? What's driving this? In my view, it's mostly Hong Kong. In other words, the instability in Hong Kong caused everyone to say, well, that's the end of one country, two systems. Well, that leaves Taiwan policy in a bad place from Beijing's point of view. And then, of course, the military balance, which has, if there ever was one, it strongly shifted in Beijing's favor. I mean, this is something I really focus on, and I will say, if you think it would be challenging for the United States to conquer Cuba, if the U.S. really wanted to, I would say that the analogy applies quite well to Taiwan and China. So I think what keeps me up at night is how to prevent kind of a catastrophic war over Taiwan. I'm really focused on that, and it's not just the possibility of war, it's the possibility of rivalry and all the costs that go with that. And I'm very concerned that we pay so much attention to the rivalry and possibility of war, which, as what I would term a Cold War begins to pick up steam, that we forget other important issues, pandemic, climate change, and so forth. I guess I'll end by foot stomping a wonderful piece I thought by Bill Overholt recently in The Hill, where he asked very upfront whether the current administration has the proper China knowledge, really, to do serious diplomacy with Beijing. So let me stop there, but thanks again for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks. And while I think the last time I was on a panel with you, I was struck by. We're going to get into Taiwan in a little bit, but I was struck by your terming of Taiwan as the most dangerous place on earth. And, we're interested to hear what you have to say, that you think it's cooled down a little bit, because I did notice that the Japanese prime minister in Japan, that it looks like it's in its own bit of a tailspin with COVID at the moment. But the Japanese prime minister earlier this week emphasized that, he would join Japan would join a U.S. coalition potentially to thwart an invasion of Taiwan. So we'll get into that in a second. So, Richard, if you could please introduce yourself and give us, a few brief remarks.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. Thank you, Arda. Thank you, everyone from IPD for putting this panel together. So I'm Richard Hanania. I'm a research fellow at Defense Priorities. I'm also the president of the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. I've written a bit on U.S.-China relationships for Defense Priorities and in other places. And so when we think about China and sort of how it perceives the world, I mean, I think we have to sort of start from looking at the United States and what it's doing, because China, is watching our politics. They're watching American behavior. They're watching other countries too, and so their perceptions of what the U.S. is doing, is going to affect the way they see their rise and the way they see their place in the world. I think there's a temptation to fall into an understanding in which we project sort of American ideas about how states behave onto other countries. So the idea, you'll see it framed as, what kind of world order does China want? What kind of system does it want for the globe? And the assumption here is that China is like the U.S. in that it has a preference over the entire planet and how the entire planet is governed. The U.S. wants free trade. They want democratization. They want respect for human rights. They care about what happens in Africa, and they care about what happens in the Middle East. And there's no reason to think that every country in the world thinks like this. And there's, and even in the case of China, I would say, there's little reason to think that they do. Now, they do have goals and they do have, aspirations, of course. But the idea that they want a world order in the sense that the United States wants a world order, I think that's sort of we're projecting the way we think and the way we do foreign policy on the rest of the world. And so thinking about the American perspective here and how it's perceived in the region, there's another thing we often project is we see this as sort of, we see this as a great power competition. There's a story here, right? There's the story that there was the rise of democracy. The U.S. Beat dictatorship in World War I and World War II. After World War II, there was the Cold War. Democracy triumphed again. Fukuyama's famous book came out, became sort of a cliche about the end of history. And this is the ideology of basically the American empire for the last century or so. And China threatens that. I mean, China threatens that psychologically, because you have a country that's become the largest economy in the world, or the second largest, depending on how you measure. If it's not the largest now, it'll be the largest soon. And it's going to naturally, like any country that rises, going to demand more of a say in the world. You don't go from the third world country to the richest country in the world without that changing your relations with other countries. Now, the other countries in the region, China's neighbors, there's no evidence that they see the rise of China the way that the U.S. does. Sure, they have problems. They have problems with China, right? So India has a border dispute. There's a South China Sea. There's problems with Vietnam. There's problems with Philippines. But these countries don't see this as a struggle between democracy and autocracy, or what the eventual world order is going to be like. We know this because we don't see a consistent move towards a sort of more aggressive posture. So for example, when China has problems in Hong Kong, when it has problems with the Uyghurs, you hear very little, almost nothing from East Asia. This is not something that they concern themselves with. This is something that the United States and Europe to a large extent concern themselves with. So you'll get statements from the US and Europe, and occasionally they'll convince Japan to go along, or they'll convince one other country to go along. But usually, it's very half-hearted, and there's not a consistent sort of messaging on, okay, there's something wrong with China's government. And so from the Chinese perspective, what this means is that there's basically room to negotiate with each of these countries. Look, you have a border dispute, you can talk about it, you can negotiate, you can pay them off, you can do whatever. I mean, Duarte, there was talks of this in the Philippines, where Duarte basically said, we're just going to give in to China, and we're going to hopefully have good trade and good relations with them. So these problems are all solvable. When a country basically doesn't like when a country doesn't like your form of government, and supports basically autonomy and to a certain extent secession, which is what they see as the Hong Kong situation, that's much harder to deal with. So if the U.S. cares about, it started in the 1990s with Tibet, and then recently you have Hong Kong, you have the Uyghurs, and if these are things the U.S. is going to concern itself with, and I don't think we can make a choice. I mean, it's hard for us to make a choice not to, because it's just the human rights part of our foreign policy is just so ingrained. That makes things difficult. Because there's no negotiation. There's no negotiation over your state's ultimate survival, over its territorial integrity. Maybe Taiwan is something that is also non-negotiable, and other countries are not as invested in the U.S. as in the survival, the continuation of the Taipei government. So this is this I think has, especially I think the U.S. as sort of moralism and foreign policy has put it in a place where even if a country wants to move, if the US, if a particular administration wants to move a little bit away from that, it's very difficult. I think Biden has tried to a certain extent. He uses the rhetoric of we're in great power competition. China is our strategic rival. He'll say things like that, but he'll also say, that doesn't mean we're going to go to war with them. We just want to manufacture more vaccines and have good diplomacy and, invest in science and technology. So I think that's pretty much where American politics is, where that's the sort of most dovish position you can take. And so, so Lyle and Kurt mentioned Taiwan. This is the only, if you imagine, someone tell you the US and China are going to have a war in the next few decades, this is really the only place you can imagine it happening. It's hard to imagine it over, IP theft or whatever. The other things we talk about are human rights or the other issues that come between US and China. This is just a place where you have to be realistic. It's a country on the other side of the world. It's China's neighbor. They care about Taiwan much more than we do. And time favors China here. Every year China grows faster than the United States because it's a middle income country, and middle income countries generally grow faster than high income countries. People talk about the Chinese birth rate. China's population is actually still growing. Taiwan is in much worse situation, has a much lower birth rate. It's actually, the population is already shrinking. So China becomes more powerful relative to the US and relative to Taiwan. And Taiwan is also a high income country too. So Taiwan is also growing slower than China. So China has time on its side here. The question may come for America. So I wouldn't expect anything in the immediate future. I wouldn't expect any major moves on China's part. The question is, what if they eventually do make a serious move? The question is what the United States would do. It's very easy from the American perspective to give out defense guarantees. We don't have a defense guarantee to Taiwan, but we're gonna we want them to think we're gonna there's an idea we're gonna come to their aid, and and that's easy to do when it's a theoretical question. It's easy to give NATO guarantees in Eastern Europe when it's theoretical and there's no, it's not going to happen next year or 5 years or maybe 10 years from now. When the rubber hits the road and the US has to start taking casualties for a place on the other side of the world most Americans can't find on a map or don't know anything about, that's a completely different question. So I think it would depend. If China made a move, I think it would depend on who's in office. But you could see China realistically expecting that Americans is more talk than actual more talk than actual action in a situation like this. So this is, every aspect of this Taiwan problem, how much each side cares about it, the power dynamics and where it's moving, the geography of it. Every single one of these things favors China. For the U.S. to be able to guarantee Taiwan's independence or semi-independence, it's the ball's in China's court. Basically, I think it's an unrealistic goal of foreign policy. The question is, can we live with it? I think we can, and other people maybe think that it would lead to something more. I don't think So I don't think the Chinese are going to make a move in the immediate future, but it's something that could be a potential problem. And I'll just say one more thing before I stop. The part of the American narrative about China is it's not just democracy and autocracy, but the autocracy is rising, and it's also a threat to its neighbors. If its neighbors saw it as a major threat, they would be begging for the U.S. to come in. And in some cases, they do want the U.S. to come in. In many other cases, and it sometimes differs depending on who's in office or not. So Duarte was a little bit leaning more towards China, and sometimes Suga in Japan is taking a little bit more hawkish view. So this switches a little bit, but there's no idea that China is basically some country on the march, and these countries' independence is ultimately threatened. If there were, the U.S. wouldn't have to go and try to convince South Korea, Japan to have closer relations. So they have a report for defense priorities on the inevitable rise of China. I mean, I would suggest people check it out, where I talk about basically, its geography, its power, its economics that's going to determine the future of this, not the future of the region, much less than anything America chooses to do. So with that, I thank you.
If you don't mind, we had a specific audience question, just real quickly. You said only Taiwan you think would be a potential flashpoint between the U.S. and Beijing. What do you think of the South China Sea? If you just 30 seconds.
Well, I mean, I think the South China Sea, that's actually a very interesting one, and I sort of put it in the same category as Taiwan because it's right there. But yeah, the U.S. does these phone-op operations where it takes the Navy and it goes through these seas, and China says, "Please don't do that," and China doesn't do anything. The U.S. does this like 6 or 7 times a year, and a few more in the last few years. Yeah, it's potentially a flashpoint. I agree. It would require a major miscalculation on one side to make this into a big deal. I think a more likely scenario is China just builds up the infrastructure, just sort of makes it a little bit harder for the U.S. to do a phone op through that area, and then one side will blink. It is potentially a dangerous situation. Yeah, that is actually a good point.
Cool, thank you. Let's move on to Paul. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Kurt, and thanks to IPD for the invitation to participate here. My name is Paul Hare. I'm a fellow at the Center for the National Interest in Washington, although I'm resident in Chicago. There's been a lot of issues, a huge basket of issues already put on the table here under the heading of the geopolitics of Asia and Chinese perceptions of its security. So I think what I'll do, like my colleagues, is just offer a few strategic level observations to contribute to the discussion. I think it's fair to say that the geopolitics of Asia today centers on a great power competition between China and the United States. And I think it's essentially a competition between a version of U.S. primacy in the region, which unfortunately for the United States, I think is almost certainly no longer sustainable, and in fact is already a thing of the past, and a version of Chinese primacy, which, and I think it's very important to emphasize this, in my view, would not necessarily be hostile or exclusive, hostile to or exclusive of a U.S. presence or U.S. influence in the region. And I know we can debate this, nor would it be necessarily characterized by coercive domination by China of its neighbors. Instead, I think the competition, in one respect, will decide what kind of peaceful coexistence China and the United States might have in Asia, if, and this is a huge if, both sides are willing to allow for that possibility, which is not yet certain, and it might not be possible. And in that context, I think it should be self-evident, but it might be necessary to emphasize, and Richard has actually already alluded to this, the other countries in the region are both the audience for and the arena for this competition between the United States and China. We're constantly told by all of them, actually, that they don't want to choose sides, with a few exceptions, especially Japan, I think, and we'll come back to that, I'm sure. They want to maintain constructive relations with both China and the United States. But I think they also have, and Richard alluded to this, I think they have different views on the nature of the challenge from China, which many of them see as more of an economic opportunity or a necessity than as a security threat. And I think they also have diverging priorities and preferences in terms of how to manage their relationships with China, so like the right balance of carrots and sticks. But I think what we pay less attention to is their different views on the relative balance of power between China and the United States, and their strategic assessment of the relative trajectory of the two big powers. The fact is, I think historically, that the rise of China and its increasing relevance to its neighbors has coincided with an erosion of their confidence in the United States, in its staying power, its reliability, its resources, its attention span. And in fact, most of the other countries in the region agree with China and much of the rest of the world, I would add, that the United States is in relative strategic decline. And maybe we can debate this too. My point here is that the perceptions of the United States in the region are just as important as perceptions of China, including and especially among US allies. I think this gets back to the central issue here of China's perceptions of its strategic environment and of its national security, because it is this dynamic, I think, within the region that defines Beijing's view of its security needs and its opportunities. And in this regard, I would highly recommend a just published book by Rush Doshi, which should get attention because Rush Doshi has just joined the National Security Council staff as a China director. It's entitled The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order. And here I think I diverge a little bit from Lyle. There's an open-ended definition or discussion or debate about what constitutes a grand strategy. I'm inclined to agree with Doshi that China does have what constitutes a de facto grand strategy. And he addresses in the book China's global strategy, but emphasizes and focuses on the importance of Beijing's strategy within the Asia-Pacific, within the Indo-Pacific, because China's strategy begins at home. Security begins at home. And this is why I think China is targeting its neighbors primarily as the foundation of its strategy. And there's two sides to this equation. I mentioned needs and opportunities. From Beijing's perspective, there is a need to be more assertive and proactive in the region because of what the Chinese have long viewed as a U.S. policy of containment against China. And this is also subject to debate, but the Chinese see this manifest, in their view, in the full range of U.S. policies in the region, including going back to the rebalance and the pivot from the Obama administration, U.S. support for the other claimants, territorial claimants in the East and South China Seas, and certainly over Taiwan, in, I guess, what was essentially the Trump administration's version of the pivot, the free and open Indo-Pacific, which has kind of melded into the Quad. These are all elements or tools of containment from the Chinese perspective. But this is reinforced in Beijing's mind by what it sees as U.S. pressure for internal change, basically liberalization and democratization in China, which Chinese leaders certainly see as an existential challenge to the CCP. And one thing I would add, all of this was reflected in Xi Jinping's promulgation early in his tenure of a new national security strategy, which was based on really a new definition, a broad definition of national security that encompassed both internal and external challenges to China and the linkages between them, importantly. On the other side of the equation, we have, I think, and Doshi talks a lot about this in his book, the opportunity that Beijing perceives to be more assertive because of primarily the shifting balance of power and China's relative capabilities, especially in the wake of the global financial crisis, which Chinese, of a dozen years ago, which Chinese leaders saw, they interpreted that as exposing the weaknesses of the United States and hastening the strategic decline of the United States. Again, I just want to highlight the book because he talks a lot about how Beijing is trying to manage this combination of needs and opportunities as it pursues its strategy. And just closing out, other countries in the region, again, are the central to this equation because both China and the United States are aiming their strategies, their policies at cultivating the alignment and support of the rest of the neighborhood. And there is obviously a global dimension to this, and we can get into that, and I hope we do. I hope we can address some of the specific cases both within the region and globally. I would just close with two other comments, not that there's not already too many issues on the table here. One comment about the Quad and one about Taiwan, which has already been mentioned. There's been a lot of attention focused on the Quad in the last year or so because the Biden administration clearly has made it a central element of its regional strategy. It's become a centerpiece of the US-led response to China, and I think it shows some promise as a regional coordinating mechanism. But on balance, I think that it's going to be constrained ultimately in its effectiveness by the diverging levels of confidence that the members of the Quad have in each other, and frankly, especially in the United States. And by diverging views among this membership on how confrontational they should be collectively or individually in dealing with China. And finally, we've already touched on the Taiwan issue, and we can go back to that. I would only observe that, and I'm a slightly heretical view on this too, as I am on some of these other things, that Taiwan would not be a priority for Beijing if, in Beijing's view, Taipei and Washington were not pushing the envelope in terms of compliance with the One China framework, which seems to have served its purpose for 40 years, but seems to be eroding. But the Taiwan issue, and this was already just mentioned as well by Kurt, I think, the Taiwan issue has become a litmus test in Tokyo for the strength of the US-Japan relationship, with lots of interesting implications we can get to. Anyway, I'll leave it at that, just to pile on here. Thanks.
Cool. Michael.
Great. Thank you very much, Kurt. It's a pleasure to be here in this webinar, sponsored by IPD. I am the director of the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Prior to that, I was at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and prior to that, I was at the RAND Corporation. All during this period, I've been studying China's military security policies, US-China relations, and other issues relating to Chinese security and the stability of the Far East in particular. So I don't want to retread a lot of the statements already made by everybody else, which are, I disagree with very little of what has been said. Some points I might quibble about. But let me just say a couple of words about Chinese views and strategy, and then particularly towards Asia, and then towards the US military in Asia, and then a couple of comments on Taiwan and Asian countries as a whole. Now, as other people have already said, China's overall national security outlook is one that's designed very much to support a certain set of goals that are focused on economic modernization, physical security, international prestige, advancing China's national sovereignty and territorial interests, things that are related to what Lyle talked about in this Fuchang, building a wealthy and strong country. But in doing this, China has tried to maintain good relations with many countries around the world and try to divert or blunt efforts to contain or undermine or weaken China's emergence. All of this is very logical when you think of a large country like China that's trying to develop and modernize and increase its influence in the world. You would expect it to definitely be doing this sort of thing. But in addition to that, of course, it has also taken a particular level of concern and focus on the West and the United States. As Paul and others have said, the Chinese leadership are, even though they have worked very closely with the United States at various times in PRC history, particularly during the height of the US-Soviet rivalry and the Chinese-Soviet rivalry during the end of the Cold War, at the same time, the Chinese have always regarded the United States in one way or another as a potential threat, I believe. And they have sought to try to insulate themselves against that threat in a variety of ways without alienating and provoking the United States to actually treat China as an enemy. And that is a very delicate and complex balancing act that the Chinese have been engaged in now for many, many years. And it's probably, assuredly, it has intensified now under the kind of rivalry that we now see that's now undergoing in Asia and other different areas and functional arenas around the world. So this rivalry is one that really needs to be bounded in many ways, because China and the United States are not in every way at each other's throats or having contrary interests. They have a lot of common interests in many areas, particularly to do with transnational threats like pandemics, climate change, global financial stability, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, countering some types of terrorism, etc. There are many areas where the United States and China really need to, in fact, they must cooperate in order to address common problems around the world. So you have to be able to strike this balance between blunting the more severe aspects of the security competition by deterring each other in some ways that they won't threaten each other's vital interests, while at the same time maintaining incentives, desires to cooperate. And that's a hard thing to do, particularly under the current situation. In Asia, China really regards the United States, as Paul and others have said, as a real concern, a growing concern, and US regards China in the same way, of course. And so you have this constant maneuvering now that is going on, increasingly taking on strategic dimensions on all the different issues in the region. What be they narrow sovereignty issues or economic issues, trade issues, of course, human rights issues. Everything is getting to be securitized. Everything is getting to be dominated by a strategic calculus that is more zero-sum than positive-sum in nature. And that is, I think, creating real danger of increased likelihood of crises as China and the US miscalculate in various ways. What I often say is that Asia is emerging into a kind of unstable balance between the United States and its allies in China. And in this kind of unstable balance, the United States, or I should say China first, is inclined to miscalculate because it's overconfident in some ways. It has gained greater leverage, greater influence, and it's able to test and show its resolve in certain ways that could provoke crises over Taiwan or whatever. And the United States, for its part, is more inclined to overreact to what the Chinese might do out of a desire to disabuse the Chinese that the United States is in relative decline, that the United States resolve and support for its allies has in any way diminished. This kind of dynamic really poses a real danger for Asia in looking ahead. Now, probably the most significant area of danger, as others have said, is regarding Taiwan. Secondarily, perhaps regarding other maritime disputes in the South and East China Sea. The more the US and China see their relationship as essentially adversarial, with each committed to weakening and subjugating the other, the more that otherwise manageable potential sources of conflict, like Taiwan and the South China Sea, will in fact be viewed as tests of strategic advantage and resolve. Each side will increasingly view Taiwan and the South China Sea islands as strategic assets to deny the other, or to strengthen control over for one's own benefit. Each side will place a dominating influence on punishment-based deterrence efforts and downplay genuine attempts at reassurance and accommodation. In my opinion, regarding these kinds of disputes, we need clear statements of non-use of force, except in extreme circumstances or others using force first. We need reaffirmed commitments to peaceful negotiation and reaching a more stable modus vivendi, and a US neutral stance on who holds the ultimate sovereign authority over Taiwan or over islands in the South China Sea. There is no alternative for the United States to its long-standing one China policy that Paul has mentioned under current circumstances. A transition by the United States to what would be regarded by China as a clear destruction or a fatal undermining of its one China position would, in my view, lead to increasing confrontation and most possibly conflict with China over Taiwan. We don't need it. It's not necessary. It's avoidable. And I think the United States really has to think twice about where it's moving in the direction of regarding Taiwan as a strategic asset. By the same token, Beijing itself needs to think beyond what I regard as its failed one China, two systems view that it had applied to Hong Kong and seeks to apply to Taiwan. It needs to be more willing to talk with the less radical elements of the Taiwan Democratic Progressive Party and reach some kind of more stable modus vivendi that doesn't result in any side making worst case assumptions. Let me just say a final word about Asian states in general. I think Asian states view China warily as a potential regional hegemon that could exert undue pressure on them in various ways. But at the same time, they view China, as Paul said, as an essential economic partner of mutual benefit. So I think many Asian states, by and large, see the challenge posed by China in far less ideological terms than does the US. They want to enmesh China in regional networks that limit its ability and desire to independently coerce others. And they want the US to remain a steady presence in the region that works with, deters, but does not necessarily provoke Beijing. They don't want the US to center its regional stance on building a simplistic anti-China coalition of democracies, which will not work for reasons that Paul and others have said. And they certainly don't want the region being rent by growing Sino-US rivalry that requires them to choose sides. As in Europe, I think many Asian states want to serve where possible as a check on the excessively zero-sum stances of both Beijing and Washington. And I think it's in the interest of the United States to try to transition to a position where it can accommodate these Asian regional interests in a much more effective and credible way, and as a way of then more effectively dealing with and engaging with China. I think that's possible, but I think currently we're not going in the right direction on this, particularly in the United States, where things are there's this balance between competing and cooperating with China, but the cooperation is kind of raised as an afterthought in most cases. The emphasis tends to be very much on competition and severe competition, and on the notion of democracy versus authoritarianism, which I think is a poor way of trying to understand what the dynamic is that the United States, China, and other countries face today in the world. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so we're going to accept audience questions. I only asked, we've gotten a bunch already. If you could get them in now, because I can't guarantee at that point that I can do it from that point. We're just limited on time. So I also specifically want to touch Taiwan because it seems like everyone agrees that that's the real hot rock. But first, I wanted to ask something that none of you touched on, which is that the potential permanence and relevance of hawkish economic activity from Washington. We talked a lot about military and strategic, but something that the Trump administration, unveiled was sanctions on Huawei and ZTE, and more broadly as a, the sort of resurrection of protectionism as a tool of statecraft also occurred under Trump and has not been, fully undone by Biden. So if all the panelists could address that real briefly. So let's just roll it back serpentine style to Michael.
Oh, okay.
If you don't mind.
No. Well, I think that the economic situation between China and the United States has certainly been distorted hugely by the Trump administration, which undertook a very simplistic approach to understanding what China's potential or actual challenges, threats were to the United States economically. It grossly exaggerated the damage that China has done to the United States, which in fact, on balance, I would say US-China economic relations have benefited the United States in the aggregate and not undermined the United States. And China's larger economic imprint in the world has also benefited most countries in the world. The World Bank estimates that China has contributed to 1/3 of global growth since 2008. I mean, that is a significant amount of contribution. So I think the real problems have to do with certain very specific issues that are sources of real contention and that are justifiable on the part of the United States in its criticism of China. China has, in many ways, observed the letter, but not the spirit of the World Trade Organization. It has resorted at times to very extensive cyber commercial espionage of various types, quite considerable in various areas. It has also engaged in various forms of pressured technology transfer of certain types. It has not, however, pursued what I would regard as a mercantilist, predatory economic policy towards the United States. But these complaints are legitimate and they do need to be addressed. But they need to be addressed not just in a bilateral way, they need to be addressed multilaterally. They need to be addressed by revitalizing and restructuring in some ways the World Trade Organization. And they need to be addressed by strengthening multilateral regional economic interactions. The CPTPP, which is the latest version of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive and Economic Program, these sorts of things need to be, I think, strengthened and in some ways revised, but the United States and China both need to become members of these initiatives so that they both can engage on ways to address their mutual concerns and not engage in this zero-sum bilateral sniping at each other with blanket tariffs and other forms of tit for tat that do not help the situation. That's my 2 cents.
Paul, if you could address Huawei and ZTE and Michael's remarks real briefly.
Well, I'll be the first to admit that I'm not an economist and I'm not a tech expert.
Oh, that's good. That's a qualification.
I guess the point I would make was that if you focus on Huawei and ZTE, I mean there are national security issues from my experience in the intelligence community that need to be addressed here, and that's a dilemma that the Chinese have to deal with in terms of how credible they expect to be as to participate in that market without raising concerns and risks. The point I would emphasize, though, is that And Michael alluded to this. I think there's a presumption. Well, there's an inclination to avoid economic interdependence with China, and I just don't think that's going to be avoidable. I think the Trump administration's approach, and in fact the general U.S. approach, I think, has often exaggerated the relative economic leverage that we have in dealing with China. In fact, I saw this. Then Secretary of State Pompeo made a speech last summer on China policy in which he said China needs us more than we need them. I've always thought that was a specious assumption to make, because the Chinese probably assume that they need us less than we think we need them. They need us, and they think we need them more than we think we need them, if you follow me on that. But I think, the whole pursuit of decoupling and breaking down some of these economic liabilities, there are real reasons to do it, but there have to be limits because it can be counterproductive. And I think it's, again, I think it's just based on an overestimation of the U.S. having the decisive economic leverage over China. The Chinese assessment of that is no doubt is different, and in fact, may be more accurate.
You're muted, Kurt.
Can't hear Kurt.
I was being too polite. Richard, if you would like to touch on Huawei and ZTE.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll touch a little bit on the general question about trade restrictions and decoupling and the tech issues. So often when we talk about in politics, it tends to there will be a trend going one way in sort of the political discussion and what politicians say, and then the policy in the real world sort of go in the other direction. So if you just follow the rhetoric and sort of the ideas in Washington, you see that there's this idea that we need to decouple. The U.S. and China need to there's a skepticism of free trade, and this started with the Trump administration. So if you look at the growth in U.S.-China trade during the Trump administration, you can't tell that anything happened in the Trump administration. It's still going up. 2020 was the highest trade deficit with the U.S. had with China ever. So I think the U.S. policy, it's a general issue where trying to make these sort of big changes to what's happened is very hard for American leaders, especially in the economic realm and national security. They can go invade another country, or they could pull troops out of a country to sort of redirect the American economy. You need some kind of major legislation to do that, and we haven't had that. And so the idea of decoupling, I think, is more theoretical than real. And I don't think it's going to become real. I think it's just unrealistic, as Paul mentioned, for economic reasons and for reasons of political economy within the United States. With Huawei, there's the threat is more theoretical than real with most of these things. There's more evidence of the U.S. colluding with its tech companies and spying on other countries than there is that China is doing the same. You could assume that in some case that's possible, but every country is not going to build its own 5G provider. So there's going to be a couple that dominate the market, and I don't think a lot of countries realize that. So the reception to Huawei has been pretty mixed. So I mean, South Korea has accepted it, Japan has not. And I think that'll continue. I think it's pretty much a litmus test for how strongly countries want to ally with the U.S. Clearly over China.
Great. And Lyle, same question.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm like the other panelists. I'm rather skeptical of the whole trade war. I think, I do think, by the way, that the trade issue is now impacting national security calculations, and that, to me, that's rather disturbing. I think before we may have thought they were basically in different bins and didn't really touch on one another too much, but here, we're really crossing the wires, and this is, adds to the danger and the friction, no question. I think a lot of Americans have suffered. I mean, look at American farmers. They don't know what to plant because for 2 decades, more or less, they saw incredible growth from the Chinese market in demand, and and now, other farmers around the world have taken up those markets. So how to get that market share back, it's going to be difficult. I think China proved itself pretty adept to flex to a new situation. Okay, we'll move all these sort of low-tech factories to Vietnam, and then the Chinese managers will run it and take their cut. And meanwhile, Vietnam can have low wages and a lot of environmental pollution. So kind of, look at the upside of offshoring a lot of Chinese industry into Vietnam. Huawei, I've never seen good evidence that this is a national security threat to the United States. I mean, they always roll out this line about the founder being a PLA, but I mean, beyond that, and by the way, in the 1970s and 80s, a lot of people were being the PLA. It's it's not a unique feature of that particular founder. As far as TPP that goes, sure, China celebrated when we decided, when Trump decided not to enter TPP, but I mean, I don't know that, I agree with Michael, I think said that, to have a trade agreement that doesn't include China is just becomes kind of part of the new Cold War. And I think that's to be avoided. It's not to say we couldn't use it kind of strategically and try to use it as a lever and bring China in. But my view is the main issue is currency. This is the root of the problem in U.S.-China trade. And I think the U.S. dollar is way overvalued because we insist on it being global currency. I think we've got to probably drop that addiction to that. And I know that'll hurt the finance industry, but the rest of America, I think, would benefit. That's my thought. And again, not an economist, but I think that's the way to go. Thank you.
I understand that's not an original thought, but it's something that I've heard increasingly entered the mainstream. This idea that if the Chinese dump us as the dollar, or a Chinese-led effort to dump us as the dollar, that'll obviously be a big deal, but that will somehow be a positive boon for the middle class and for most people in the U.S. I know you're not an economist, but why did you say that?
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say the New York, Wall Street, and so forth benefit hugely from trading, and that everything is priced in dollars and so forth. But unquestionably, that creates massive headwind for American exports and manufacturing. I mean, meanwhile, the Chinese currency is not that different from when I studied in China 20 years ago. So, I mean, to me, clearly some readjustment is in order. And I think China would go along with that probably, although, if the relationship is so hostile, I'm not sure. But to me, really, we have to, again, this is more an internal U.S. political question, right. But there has to be some kind of rebalancing there to give American exporters and workers a chance. And I think they don't have it with this very strong dollar.
And you don't think that, again, not an economist, but there has been a lot of speculation that if that event happened, especially if it happened this decade, that it would, plunge the U.S. into a depression. Additionally, just to sort of like, dog-eat-dog world impression of U.S. lost that status.
Look, we're going to be in for some psychological adjustments. And I go back to Graham Allison's brilliant piece in The Atlantic a few years ago, where he said, look, what we really need when we think of the rise of China, we just need to all readjust how we approach the world. But one of those readjustments is rethinking the role of the dollar in the world. And yes, look, I mean, it has to be done very gradually and so forth. But I think we will be quite happy to come out on the other side, where we have a lot more control over our economic destiny. Right now, we don't, and a few people benefit. You can buy your Mercedes and your fancy European cheeses, but for cheap, but it doesn't reflect reality. It's sort of a bubble.
Okay, so we have a real barrel of questions, which is a good problem to have, but I'm probably not gonna be able to get to all of them. So I'm just gonna have to be selective, and I don't know any of the names of the questioners, so don't take it personally. Well, I do know them, but I don't know them personally. So one that was interesting, and let's not go too far on it because it's a little far afield, but it is in Asia, is there was a question about Afghanistan and Biden's decision to leave. Something that I have seen sort of increasingly percolate, and this is the questioners, the gist of what the person was asking, is that somehow that the super duper secret reason why we were in Afghanistan was somehow an air base to counteract China, that would be giving the minerals to Pakistan or somehow, and like that would be again Pakistan for China, And this is not a new thing. I remember the first time I ever heard this. I believe it was Lawrence Wilkerson, the sort of fiery former PAL deputy, said that the secret Pentagon justification for all of this stuff is that actually we're in Afghanistan to counteract China. What do you think of this rationale? I obviously don't think it's going to be a very receptive audience to the polemical case for it. But what do you make of it? Was there any truth of it? And do you think it will potentially be increasingly weaponized in the press as Biden looks to try to get out by apparently late August now, so before his September 11th deadline, if we believe the White House on it? So thanks. Anyone who wants to touch it? So no order if anyone's interested in that, or I'll just call. Lyle.
Well, I would just say I think it's a great thing that our forces are leaving Afghanistan. I think it's been a tremendously frustrating. I think American people have been against this for a long time, and the resources and unfortunately many lives were lost. And I have to say, thinking quite cynically, yes, I do think there was probably a China angle here. Occasionally, people have made that argument. I think that argument is ridiculous. If you wanted to make it, you would say, well, China is sort of vulnerable out there on the Western flank. It's between Russia and China, but in particular, it's very close to Xinjiang, which is a very tense situation. So if we, wanted to flow weapons in there or something at some point, if it got really dark in U.S.-China relations, I think that is really crazy thinking, and even that suggestion is can itself injure U.S.-China relations. No wonder people don't talk about it publicly, but I think it's a very good thing that we're leaving. This is not only good for U.S. national security, but it's probably good for U.S.-China relations. And probably, I have to say, in the end, it will be good for Afghans and for Central Asia as well. Thank you.
Got it.
I would just add there that, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead, Paul.
If our purpose in going to Afghanistan was to deal with China, why would we be leaving now? I agree with Lyle that was a minor consideration, it would seem to me. I think our departure from Afghanistan poses some dilemmas for the Chinese. I mean, certainly they're glad to have us out of their backyard, but we're setting the stage for the renewal of destabilizing Afghanistan, which China doesn't want in its backyard.
I think I think I agree. It's with others that it's ridiculous. If there's a war with China, you have this, sort of island of a few thousand soldiers in the middle of this landlocked country, sort of sandwiched between China and Russia. But I think it's a ridiculous idea. But I wouldn't be surprised if people make it. There was a congressman the other day who said we can't give up this Bagram Air Base. It's right right on the borders of Iran, Russia, and what.
You remember who said this, or there?
It was a congressman. I forget which one. It was a Republican congressman.
Republican.
I don't remember who. And he said, this is between Russia, China, and Iran, so it's a strategic location. You can't even pacify Afghanistan. You're going to use Afghanistan as a base to fight back against Russia, China, and Iran. I wouldn't be surprised, though, if people make this argument, because my experience is that when the military wants to do something, they'll throw anything at the wall and see what sticks. So right now, China is the hot topic. So if you want to stay in Afghanistan, you go to a Democratic congressman and you talk about women's rights and all the gains we've been made. And you talk to people, who are worried about China, and you say China is the threat. And then you talk to people who are worried about Iran, and you say, Iran's a threat. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if someone made that case. People make that case in public. Is it a logical case or a realistic reason to be there? I don't think so. I think it's more of a post hoc justification.
Anybody else want to bite at this? Okay. Before we return to audience questions, let's put a bow on what we talked about before. I think there was potentially two points that stuck out of me on Taiwan. One from Paul and one from Lyle. Paul thought the news about Japan this week that Suga sort of very clearly signaled that they were with the U.S. in potentially a military exchange with the Chinese. That was important. So please, Paul, go. And then Lyle, you indicated that there was grounds for optimism that came out of Washington this week, which I'm not familiar with, or grounds for optimism that there won't be an exchange anytime soon. So Paul and Lyle.
Well, actually, I'm not sure that it was a very clear signal from Suga. There have been several statements. In fact, this goes back to Suga's visit to Washington a couple months ago, where he secured, well, actually, he was talked into, who apparently was receptive to the joint statement he issued with President Biden, referring to our joint interest in stability in the Taiwan Strait. But immediately upon his return to Tokyo, he was criticized within the Diet and had to withdraw from that. Well, not retreat somewhat rhetorically from that. And I think that you had, I can't remember, there was a member of the cabinet, a minister or a vice minister who pushed the envelope here in terms of the importance of Taiwan to Japan's security and tried to make the case that Japan would be with us if we went into a conflict with China over Taiwan. But he too retreated somewhat. I think there's an unresolved debate in Japan about how explicit to be on this issue. As I said earlier, it's become kind of a litmus test in Tokyo of the U.S.-Japan alliance. But I don't think there's a strong consensus yet as to how that should play out. So I think it's we may be overstating the content and the sustainability of some of the sentiments we've been hearing out of Japan, because every time the Japanese officials push this envelope, there's debate in the legislature and kind of back and forth. So I'm not sure the signal has been that clear just yet.
Okay.
If I could just add a couple of comments to what Paul
Please.
just said. I very much agree with Paul on this. Japan is indeed struggling with the issue of what its security interests are across the Western Pacific and how active it should be in working closely with the United States in the defense of Taiwan if you have a conflict there. I think there is enormous amounts of differing views on this, ambivalence. I think that more conservative right-wing groups in Japan want to play up certain confrontations with China, particularly over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, in order to justify a more hawkish assessment of Chinese behavior. And in doing that, I think they are, in part, you could argue, provoking incidents with the Chinese over the Senkakus and Diaoyu Islands in the hopes that that will create greater animosity that could then be used to try to move Japan on the issue of how much it will support the United States vis-a-vis Taiwan and other defense issues.
To be clear, these are people well to the right, if that can be used.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the Suga government. I'm talking about people on the right, but there are some sympathies, perhaps in parts of the Suga government. You saw, as Paul mentioned, in comments made by the Minister of Defense and the Deputy Minister of Defense about the criticality of Taiwan for the defense of Japan, which would be really in contradiction to Japan's one China posture regarding Taiwan. So, you know, there is this movement in Japan, just as there is in the United States, to try to redefine the nature of Taiwan and how the US and Japan should posture itself towards that issue.
And I still wanted to hear from Lyle on what he thought out of Washington this week on Taiwan.
Yeah, although if I can, I'd like to comment on the Japan question as well, because I don't know if your listeners, they may want to go and review the history here, but Japan occupied Taiwan for 50 years, from 1895 to 1945. So, I mean, the historical bonds, the cultural bonds are very intense. Taiwan's first freely elected president, Lee Teng-hui, had served in the Japanese army and was fluent in Japanese, obviously. So, by the way, highly recommend Ezra Vogel's book, China and Japan. That has a fascinating discussion of Japan's occupation of Taiwan and colonization. But I agree with Paul and Michael that this is a crucial part of the question and kind of diffusing this time bomb, honestly, is what I describe it as. Now, getting back to your original point, like, am I optimistic? I'm never optimistic. I mean, this is extremely dangerous. I can't, I still maintain, I agree with The Economist. The Economist said this is the most dangerous place in the world. I absolutely agree. I've been saying that for years. It's even more dangerous when I than when I originally said that a few years ago. And I think we need to take this absolutely seriously. And I'd like to see energetic diplomacy from Washington, maybe from Tokyo too, but between Washington and Beijing on this question. You know, I'd like to see a kind of constant sort of dialogue. I don't think that's going on at all. Really, what's going on is just military signaling. Now, I have momentary optimism. That is, I don't think the war is going to start tomorrow. Partly because Kurt Campbell, who's I guess the Asia director at NSC, that he said, I think quite emphatically, that we're going to maintain our one China principle, and that, you know, that's an important statement. It seems to have been received by the Chinese side, who were kind of, you know, there's some evidence already suggesting that, you know, that his message has been received, and they want to get back to a quote normal spot. Now, that said, though, I have long said, and here I might disagree with some of the other panelists, that, you know, if Xi Jinping and the leadership decide that the time is right and that this will be good for China and good for the party, I don't think that's something we will necessarily know when that happens. And I think it will be, if you will, a bolt from the blue. That is almost entirely without surprise. I mean, everything I read and the Chinese in Chinese military doctrine suggests that they understand they would benefit very much so if this was a surprise and they're able to achieve a fait accompli. So, I mean, paradoxically, and here I hate to make this a methodological discussion, but when you least think it will happen, it might well happen. So, I mean, that's just the nature of military conflict. Chinese understand that. Thank you.
Quick pushback, and if anyone wants to, you know, answer this, they're welcome to. You know, something that I've been sort of ruminating on is that perhaps it would be a lot sooner than we'd like to imagine. So, if you look at what's going on in Japan, it looks like it's going to be this very weird lobotomized Olympics where people aren't going to be able to attend in person. There's already the prospect. I think it's on the fringes now, but you can see it. The fringes of the Republican Party now, but you can see it becoming mainstream quite quickly, where there could be a boycott effort for the Summer Olympics, assuming they go somewhat normally next year. Additionally, that, you know, if you think that the lab leak hypothesis has any legitimacy whatsoever, if that becomes mainstreamed and the Chinese are on the defensive there, and additionally that, of course, Xi is essentially a dictator, but, you know, he does have to do some PR to maintain his quest for a third term next year. Would any of these sort of external pressures create the likelihood, also whether or not they view Biden as a quote unquote weak on China, especially compared to Trump, or I would say basically any generic Republican successor to Trump? All of these views, all of these factors could, in theory, make the Chinese want to move way sooner rather than later. Does anyone think anything of that? Lyle, you have your hand raised, so yep.
Well, I do think, I mean, I hate to say it, but and here I think probably the other panelists disagree, but I think, 10 years ago, we're in a situation where the probability of Taiwan conflict was probably like 1%, maybe 2%. And now I think we're way above that, something on the order of 15%, maybe 20% likelihood. So that, to me, that's on any given day, it's very unlikely, but it's still way too likely for, for me to sleep well at night. I think the Chinese military in particular, the way that they are talking, I'll just give you one example. I mean, the way they've talked about the Korean War anniversary over the last couple of years, this is kind of a cult of sacrifice and death and how to stand up to the Americans. I couldn't emphasize enough how much the kind of, if you will, a kind of need for martyrs, if you will, a call for martyrs. That's very disturbing. Now, that's on one side. On the other side, I will say, what's encouraging, I think, and this is kind of strange, but maybe the opposite of where you were going with the whole pandemic thing, but the party, at least in China, within China, was able to declare themselves victors over COVID, having stopped it, and they were very proud of that. And I think that did give the party a boost internally. for its effectiveness in battling the pandemic. So, I mean, that boost, may be sufficient to keep, the party happy for a while. But, I get to worry. I worry a lot when when party prestige is very low, then does Xi Jinping and people around him have a need to do something extraordinary, to justify the party's existence, to, in other words, to use a conflict to enhance their legitimacy. So that, I think, is a scary possibility that we may be looking at it sometime in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, Biden has got to study his internal review of it, and it would probably be like for 9/11 report. It won't really deliver the goods, but of course there is this prospect that that Biden's administration, whether or not it wants to, sort of mainstreams skepticism of what we were told last year. So Michael wanted to say something. So
I just wanted to add a couple of comments about the Chinese calculus. I mean, we don't know for sure what the Chinese calculus is regarding Taiwan. We can never say never about their willingness to go and use force against Taiwan, but I would say that it's not a case that the Chinese are measuring their desire or willingness to use force against Taiwan in purely military terms. In other words, I don't believe it's the case the Chinese have decided that Taiwan cannot be reunited with the mainland peacefully, and therefore they will use force when they achieve the capability, in their view, that they could succeed. I think it remains essentially a political question, and that the costs and risks for the Chinese of attempting to use force against Taiwan in a really serious, no kidding way are enormous. And it wouldn't just have implications for the immediate vicinity around Taiwan, it would have major implications across the region and across the globe. It would reorder the nature of US, China, Western, Asian relations. And it would make it much more difficult for the Chinese in a whole host of areas to advance their objectives. That I think they would have to conclude that they really had little other choice other than to attempt some effort at using force, even if they thought they might fail. But that calculus would have to come in the face of real pressure, that their options had really run out. And I think that, we're not saying and doing things that are reassuring in that regard right now, but I would be surprised if the Chinese are seriously thinking at this point that they can actually invade and seize Taiwan, because I really don't see it. I think on a military basis, they could certainly punish the hell out of Taiwan. They might be able to launch a blockade of Taiwan, but actually seizing and holding Taiwan is a different story.
What would a blockade look like? I mean, it's similar to, I don't know. I mean,
a blockade would basically be mining and placing ships outside of China, of Taiwan's major ports, which are all on the west side of the island, therefore between Taiwan and China. And so there's an argument that China could very well try to prosecute a blockade rather than what Lyle said, a bolt from the blue, and that they could be possibly see this as more successful over time because of the combined effort to punish Taiwan, blockade Taiwan, and try to deter the US from coming to Taiwan's assistance without necessarily having to invade Taiwan. But all of that is infused with high levels of risk and cost for the Chinese that they will not want to go down, in my view, unless they absolutely think they have no choice.
As to be clear, so a blockade looks like, I suppose like the most major, equivalent I can think of was the GCC maneuver against Qatar in recent years. Like, does that look like affecting flights in and out of Taiwan? Like, would you be able to fly from US to, I never heard of this before. This is interesting.
Oh, you haven't heard of a blockade?
No, I've heard of a blockade. I've never heard of this particular option for the.
Sure.
Like, would that affect?
It would be a primarily naval blockade. The Chinese would not be shooting down commercial jetliners going into Taiwan.
Right.
It would be primarily a naval blockade to prevent Taiwan from obtaining essential energy, raw materials, and other things that Taiwan is very dependent on. Taiwan has very few indigenous resources. So the question is, the Chinese could set something up and the United States would actually have to do something aggressively against the Chinese, initiate action against the Chinese to disrupt it. unless the Chinese were to first attack American bases in Okinawa and other places nearby as part of a blockade strategy, which would be hugely escalatory. I'm not saying the Chinese are about to do this. I'm not saying it's by far the most likely thing they would do. I'm just saying that there are different options that they could take other than invading, but they would all be very high risk.
Thank you.
I agree.
Richard, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, once again, I'll go back to the trajectory. China is continuing to grow 5% a year. The US is continuing to grow 2% a year. Taiwan has worse population demographic problems than China. So China gets stronger every year here. And I think Michael's right. I think the naval blockade is sort of underrated. You could basically starve Taiwan if you wanted to. I mean, it wouldn't be that would be much easier than an amphibious invasion. And you can let the planes come in, but they need raw materials through the sea. That's the cheapest way. That's the cheapest way to deliver things. So I would be shocked. I think that we should, the idea that China needs to invade Taiwan and take it over to establish legitimacy. I don't see any evidence that China's legitimacy is in any way threatened. I mean, they have a censorship system that works pretty well. They have, by all indications, popular support rooted in the economic growth that's occurred over the last 30 years. So yeah, I mean, if you get desperate, things can happen. But I don't think we should assume Chinese fragility. I think that's a mistake analysts have been making for a while.
To yank it back just real briefly, there have been some concern that I skipped over Paul in a previous question. Did you answer questions about ZTE and Huawei? Did you have anything to say about that? Sorry to put you on the spot there.
Well, I mean, I just addressed the general economic interdependence issue in that context. But I would add on the Taiwan issue here. I agree with Richard that time is arguably on Beijing's side in terms of relative capabilities. And the Chinese leadership takes some comfort in that. But I think at the same time, they perceive that time is not on their side in terms of political developments on the island and on the development of the relationship between Taiwan and the United States. That's why I think that there's a potential here. I'm not sure that the diversionary war theory applies. I don't think the Chinese would launch an attack on Taiwan to detract attention from other problems or if they ever did it, it would certainly be in part to assert their legitimacy. The point I would emphasize is that the Chinese are not looking for, I've written about this, the Chinese aren't looking for reasons and excuses to use force against Taiwan. They're looking for excuses and reasons not to. And the problem is that they don't perceive that they're getting those reasons. And that's why they're approaching contemplation that peaceful unification is no longer possible. And they might have to implement their anti-secession law of 2005. Again, I don't think this is imminent. But I think that their calculation of the strategic environment and whether their wishes are going to be achieved creates a really serious dilemma for all the parties involved.
Lyle.
Yeah, just to debate a little bit some of these questions. I mean, I think the argument I make it's and one reason I'm so worried, it's deeper than just legitimacy. It's also kind of court politics. And here you have the problem, I think, increasingly of that the PLA is kind of lifted up as a kind of prestigious part of society. It's given, if you look at the Chinese news and things like that, you see it plays this extraordinary role. But, how to put it, if you build a hammer, everything looks like a nail. These guys with all their fancy kit, they're anxious to show it off and so forth. So this is just the nature of, military organizations, I could tell you. So, I mean, it's a very complex set of calculations, but, if you don't think that every day in the PLA, they think about a Taiwan scenario, it's not an afterthought. I mean, this is the main reason for their existence, honestly, beyond border control and so forth. So I think we'd better not underestimate that, or we're in for a surprise. One other thing I'll say is I kind of disagree. I mean, look, the blockade is quite feasible for China. I think they could. I argued they could carry that out in 2004. I wrote in International Security saying that was 20 years ago. I mean, they're much more capable today of that scenario. However, there are things that are attractive about an invasion. That is, Taiwan could hold out in a blockade scenario for a long period. I mean, maybe a year, maybe two, maybe, that's a lot of time for things to go wrong. An amphibious invasion arguably could be over in a month or less, and especially with a lightning strike. This doesn't have to be high tech. Everybody likes to say, well, they don't have enough lift. Well, if you just have to go 90 miles and it's a relatively small area and you control the air and you have, a massive amount of firepower to keep the defenders' heads down, you can just use, very low tech. I think China could put 10 or 20,000, ships into the strait. That's quite a target set. And I'm not even talking about all the airborne forces and helo-borne forces. So I think this is not, how to put it, a lot of naysayers on the amphibious invasion, but I think I'm convinced China is quite capable of pulling this off. Thank you.
Yeah, and they're not either or. I mean, you could alternate between them. If you do an amphibious invasion, you're going to blockade them. You could go back and forth. I mean, the point is they have the geographical advantage. It's their backyard, and they have the power advantage, and you have the control over the air. You have options when the rubber hits the road. You don't know how things are going to play out, but I think we're going to realize if this ever happens, that China's sort of in the driver's seat in any conflict, not necessarily the U.S. or anybody more distant.
Yes. So, we've got somebody commenting in the audience fairly prolifically emphasizing their relative experience to Richard, saying that what she learned from the Vietnam War, which Richard was too young for, this person is emphasizing, is that all the official government rationales for why we were anywhere were fake, and so that we actually are in Afghanistan for China. I just as this occurred, the president has called a press conference to justify U.S. course vis-a-vis in face of mounting Taliban violence. The other thing she said, which I thought was interesting, was that it was William F. Buckley. She says who said that the only freedom that we're preserving, first and foremost, was the freedom to get rich and stay rich. Under this maxim, it's the Chinese Communist Party that is delivering for its constituents far more than. And you're nodding in agreement, Richard. So it's quite interesting. So let's say all these sentiments are quite right, and this all seems like a huge mess. And then it would be American blood and treasure, and on the beaches of Taipei and Taiwan. What would a U.S. Really just extraordinarily cut its losses look like? This is a question of can the U.S. even get out? So this is something I'm sort of personally more sympathetic to, which is not whether the merits of fighting this, it's just the sort of mechanics of, can we even leave? Is this just actually inevitable, and we should prepare for that? And so what would a U.S. exit from the region, from the South China Sea specifically, even look like?
Well, I mean, the advantage is the mechanics. I mean, that's hard in a case where you actually have troops in a country, right? The U.S. doesn't have permanent bases in the South China Sea or Taiwan, so maybe it might be easier than you think. I mean, you're usually that's why the military often doesn't want to leave someplace, because it's much harder to leave when you're not there. Like if Afghanistan was having a civil war today, nobody would say send American troops in. They think you were crazy. But the fact that we were there makes them say, okay, let's leave them there. So it might not actually be that hard. I mean, we could actually walk away.
Anybody else want to bite at that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I would just say that, Taiwan is a particular situation. We don't have forces on Taiwan, at least not formally, that I know of. So I think, inevitably, if this happens, the president will be in a very, very small time window, have to declare, whether he's sending U.S. forces in or not. I fear that will be an extremely dangerous moment, probably a Cuban Missile Crisis type moment. Wouldn't be surprised if there are nuclear signaling going on at that point. China reveals actually it has a lot more DF-41s than we thought. Something like that. But this would come at a time and place of China's choosing. So I mean, that's very disturbing. But the South China Sea, I think, is something quite different. I mean, I don't see really even a need to retreat, quote, from the South China Sea. I mean, restraint is in order, but to me, the Chinese have gotten quite used to our ships going in and around these reefs, and As long as we're cautious and aren't looking for a fight, I don't think that needs to stop. I mean, they don't like it, but I haven't really seen, certainly lately, any behavior that makes me think that we're, on trigger alert there. I think we can continue our very light presence there, and that is sort of offshore balancing, which I think is fine. Taiwan, though, is quite a different matter, and there I think we really are looking at an extremely dangerous situation.
Is there any reason to believe that the Chinese? I mean, is there any solid intelligence to indicate that the Chinese are potentially under emphasizing their nuclear arsenal somehow?
Excuse me, that they're what? That they're emphasizing?
Well, Lyle indicated, sorry, that I'd never heard this either. It's finding interesting that the idea that the Chinese actually have more nukes than they say.
Well, no, I think Lyle's just speculating about what you might see the Chinese try to do if they wanted to engage in nuclear signaling in a Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, there are. Just over the last week, there was a fascinating report showing that there's a lot of silo building going on out in Gansu province. And, many of us have been saying for a while that actually, if we keep going down the path we're on with China, that there will almost inevitably be a Chinese nuclear buildup. Now, we haven't really seen hard evidence of that, but I mean, now these silos, I think, are a very good sign. And I've seen they're moving quite robustly with the naval part of their triad. So, I mean, will they seek to reach where we are in warheads? No, I don't think in the near future, but some kind of buildup does seem to be in order. And, how many cities need to be destroyed in a nuclear war to say that it wasn't worth it? I don't think very many.
If the premise of the question was was with regard to a U.S. conventional military withdrawal from the Western Pacific, I just don't think that's conceivable for the foreseeable future. I mean, obviously, the Chinese would like over the long term for there not to be a U.S. military presence in the region, in at least as much as they believe that its purpose is to contain China. I mean, there was a time during part of the Cold War that the U.S. military purpose was acknowledged by the Chinese as serving some purpose for them in the region, primarily that of containing Japan, actually, preventing Japan from becoming a number threat. But that is eroded completely because the Chinese see the U.S. military presence and the alliance with Japan is primarily aimed now at containing China. And they see it as aimed at preventing the reunification of Taiwan. And that's why it's such a big issue. But I think that, Lyle made a reference to offshore balancing. There are certainly ways to reposition our forces in the region, but they're so central to the alliance network, which are so central to our own strategies in the region. It would be, an abandonment of our alliances for us to unilaterally withdraw from the region militarily. And I just don't see anyone in Washington considering that as a possibility. Now, there are certainly, as I said, ways to acknowledge the encroaching reality that our military primacy in the region has eroded considerably, and that should be the rationale for a reassessment of what our force posture should be. And I won't invite Michael to go into length on this. He can, but he's done some work on what that might look like. But the question of what a U.S. withdrawal from the region would look like, I think, is not a realistic one, and I think even the Chinese don't anticipate that.
Okay, so two final questions. One, to lead off, it's again Japan-centric. How does the regional comprehensive economic partnership and its ratification in the Japanese Diet affect all of this? Affect relations in the Quad? If anyone can take it.
Well, I think it just shows that the Japanese are committed to engaging in multilateral economic interactions. The Japanese took over the TPP and pushed it forward when the United States withdrew and dropped the ball. Now there are good reasons for arguing that the TPP does not serve certain worker interests in the United States, that it would not necessarily on balance serve those narrower domestic economic interests. The argument for the TPP was from a US perspective to a great extent strategic. It had to do with getting the countries in the region involved in a general network of economic interaction that would create incentives, in particular for reducing protectionism and drawing the Chinese in, because they would feel that they would need to be part of it in order to really continue to benefit from the region. And that was a strategic calculation that existed at the time. And the United States backed away from it because of domestic pressure within certain areas in the United States. And that is legitimate pressure. And the United States really would have been better off if it had tried, when it was involved in the TPP, to try to revise elements of it so that it didn't have a negative effect on American workers. That might still be possible if the US is still re-engages, but the TPP has become less oriented towards engaging on those issues than it used to be. So it's a challenge, but Japan, I think, is committed to this. Japan's committed to engaging in these kind of multilateral economic interactions, and I think the US should attempt to try to do this as well, and do it with the Chinese, not as a way of undermining or countering the Chinese, which is what we're currently doing.
Do you think anyone else is heading in the Japanese direction that's a major player? Or sorry, Michael, do you think?
I think our other allies agree with Japan that the United States should get back in.
Right.
Because there was a geoeconomic and a geostrategic rationale, as Michael has outlined. And I think the Japanese action is aimed in part at encouraging us to come back to the field.
Yeah, I mean, it's just considering that both Clinton and Trump were against it in 2016, it just would be sort of unimaginable that suddenly that Biden would spearhead the approach. But that's my own annotation. Unless somebody else had anything else further to say, there was a question that I thought was interesting going back on the economics. To what degree does the rise of crypto play into any of this? I saw a sort of comment from Peter Thiel on a panel with Robert C. O'Brien, the former national security advisor, and Mike Pompeo, that he thought that somehow that the rise of crypto was a Chinese weapon functionally because it undermined the U.S. currency. How, even if you don't buy into that, how much will the rising U.S.-China competition be affected at the same time by to my mind probably the greatest rivals of the dollar, which is the rise of cryptocurrency?
I think the benefit of crypto is the anonymity. So the question is, so the U.S. basically controls basically the U.S. dollar and its pressure, its ability to control the banking system means that it can place sanctions on anybody it wants. So if it wants to starve a country, if it wants to basically strangle their economy, and they do this regularly. I mean, they do it to Venezuela and Korea and North Korea and Cuba, and to a lesser extent, other nations like Belarus. They'll get their leadership. And so the point of crypto is it can be anonymous. So you can do trade without anybody noticing. Whether you could do like large scale international trade that no one will notice, that's a different question. Yeah, I don't know. The crypto people are all over the place. It's hard to say. Some people say that it's gonna Balaji says it's gonna basically destroy the nation state, and all countries are basically gonna lose power and they're gonna lose control, and it's gonna empower people. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not an expert. These are the predictions, and they're sort of all. Other people say it's not a big deal at all. So they're all over the place, and this is sort of a wild card. But the main threat is potentially to the American sanctions regime, and the extent that
which Biden is loosening. There was a recent report in the Journal about this.
They were thinking of. I mean, I thought that was very preliminary. I saw the same article. I think they're thinking about loosening it, and they've done a little bit on the edges with Iran. There hasn't been major reverse. So even the stuff like on Venezuela and Cuba, which like Obama did it. Obama went in the opposite direction with Cuba, and that like a Democratic president would have never done. Even that stuff is still there. We still have tougher sanctions on Venezuela than we did before. So we'll see if Biden takes a step back, but it hasn't been a great reluctance to use sanctions. I mean, it's pretty much been just keeping most of the Trump policies.
Lyle, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm not too well versed on crypto, although my understanding is the Chinese took a kind of a dim view of it. But I will say on my last trip to China pre-COVID, I will say I was amazed how this is like a totally cashless society, more or less, as far as I could tell, and made some hassle for me because I wasn't used to that. But I think we have to entertain a future where China is the largest economy on earth, and they're setting a lot of the new kind of norms as far as how it works. And that's going to take a lot of readjustment. I would welcome some kind of retreat from that whole massive sanctions regime, because I think, that is self-defeating in the end, because it just forces all these countries to look for other ways and to retaliate and things like that. And in general, I think this is a huge drag on international trade and development. So I would like to see that revisited across the board.
What is a drag on international development trade?
Well, just this like massive sanctions regime. I think the U.S. has sanctions on almost 100 countries in various forms, and this is including Germany. I think it's one point. I mean, it's to me this has reached a level of insanity and makes trade lawyers very rich, but the rest of us are not benefiting. We should let trade flourish, and trade has all kinds of beneficial effects, including making everybody wealthier. Maybe the climate is not necessarily benefit, but I think we need to rethink the sanctions.
All right. Well, on that note, unless we have any further remarks, I want to thank Arda and the team, and we're gonna call it unless Arda has anything further to say.
I just want to thank everyone for being here, and all to our wonderful audience, and for all the questions. Again, a recording of this program will be available on the YouTube page of IPD. I urge everyone to subscribe and to let your friends and colleagues know about this program. And also a reminder that in 2 or 3 weeks, we'll be in touch about a third conversation as part of this series on the nature of the geopolitical digital technology competition between China and the US, parts of which was already sort of alluded to today. And I think that will also be a wonderful conversation. Please subscribe to our YouTube again, and I hope to see you guys again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very cool.
Thanks, Arda. Thanks, everyone.